There we go.
Okay. And there we go, Mark. How are you doing today for episode 4 of Uplink?
I'm good. I've, as some people know on Twitter, I've been whinging all day about the builders next door running around with their bulldozers and landscape gardening. I think what I've come down to is that it was a recreation of the battlefield of the Somme earlier in the week. Now they seem to have gone for a big patch of astroturf and concrete slabs for everything else. So it's going to be a rather interesting garden next door. But anyway, they're quiet now, so we're good. And it's a good time for us to have an uplink instead.
Indeed. Well, I mean, if you hear some ambient noises in the background, I mean, I'm quite frankly stunned that Angus, my cat, hasn't made an appearance yet. But yeah, it is it's only a matter of time. Maybe today's the day. So it's a special time. And I got to be honest. For the end of the week, this is quite frankly the best segue possible for me, because I'm not sure about you, Mark, but I pretty much spend my weekends swimming in the world of science fiction and escapism. And we have some pretty special guests with us today, don't we?
We do indeed, yes. So we have 2 science fiction authors who share something which is very interesting as well. They're both astronomers or ex-astronomers, both trained, got PhDs in astronomy and astrophysics. And the first of those is Alastair Reynolds, who fiction fans will be no surprise at all, partly because, of course, he's one of the great writers and world builders of science fiction today, but also as an astronomer, he worked at the European Space Agency for a number of years. In fact, he left just at the same time as I arrived. I'm going to ask him whether that was a coincidence, but around 2009, he got a really good book deal. He had written a couple of novels already, and then became a full-time author at that point. So Alastair, of course, and the picture behind me tonight is kind of that, symbolically world building. Alastair's science fiction is on such an epic scale. He often starts very small, something very human, but by the end of the book, you're just blown away by the scale of the stuff that he's constructed. But it's always hard, the science is always there. I think that's all important for Alastair's work. And the other person we have on is Pippa Goldschmidt, another PhD astronomer. Worked at Imperial College and in Edinburgh, and her science fiction goes in a slightly different direction. She uses fiction as a way of effectively retelling the stories of some of the great scientific discoveries and discoverers, and putting kind of a poetic spin on how they may, in a fictional sense, discoverers of great principles of science, how they would fit into a science fiction universe. So I'm really excited about having the 2 of them together tonight, because it's sort of, Alastair's very outlooking in some sense, and Pippa looks a bit more back to the earth. Yeah,
well, I mean, what do you think about, so much of, science fiction, it's not just science fiction, right? It's also great storytelling as well, which I suppose, perhaps it's less the case in literature, but certainly more the case, I think, in so much television and film content that I think sometimes people lose the plot a little bit. They get lost in the visuals, which I think is certainly very much the case these days as well.
Yeah. Well, I maintain the best science fiction isn't actually about outer space. It isn't about the big structures that are erected. It's about putting human beings into what if scenarios and challenging them, seeing how would we behave. And I've talked to you about this a lot. Maybe it'll come up this evening. I've read a lot of Chinese science fiction recently, and that comes from a very different perspective, from the kind of Western golden age science fiction tradition of Asimov and Bradbury and Heinlein. And then, the more modern writers on the Western side, like Alastair and Pippa, another approach. So as I say, for me, it's about the human condition as much as it's about spaceships flying around. Although you can have both. Both can be fun.
Indeed. Well, I guess, I suppose we can ask our guests in a few minutes. I've always kind of thought that science fiction is a bit like a modern mythology in many ways. In some ways, it kind of substitutes what mythology used to do. Biblical parables, a lot of ancient mythos with futuristic scenarios, ones that people can actually envision and believable. Once we move beyond talking animals, with the exception of Chewbacca, I guess, who speaks in a certain sense. We use science fiction very much in the same way to teach lessons about morality, ethics, and not just portray futures, right?
Yeah, well, famously, Joseph Campbell He works about exactly that, about myths and human archetypes, strongly informed Lucas's writing in Star Wars. So now, you know, we can argue whether Star Wars is science fiction or just cowboys and Indians in space, but we'll get into that.
Indeed. Well, you know, without further ado, I think we're going to bring Alastair in. Pippa might be having a couple of technical gremlins at the moment. These things do happen, but we'll begin, and well, let's just pose the question to him as well. So any minute now, Alastair should be appearing on screen. It's always so exciting. There he is. How are you doing, Mr. Reynolds?
Get my hand there.
All right, hang on a minute. We're going to wait for
audio from you out.
Audio. There he is. How are you doing again, Alastair?
I'm excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, wonderful to see you again. And, you know, I got to say, well, on behalf of everyone at Space Rocks, it's nice to see you again. Of course, you were part of our inaugural event, which feels like an eternity ago. It was only just 2 years ago now.
It was a great day, though, wasn't it? It was a real intense, you know, experience. Lots of good memories. I really enjoyed it. And good to see Space Rocks has gone on from strength to strength. And hopefully there's lots to come in the future.
Indeed. Well, I mean, I guess just like a lot of people these days, we're finding ways to adapt, finding new ways to connect with people. Certainly, you know, it's not just about getting people in a room, but sometimes, I guess, getting people into these little Zoom chats as well, to kind of ask the big questions and all that. So what's keeping you busy these days? I hate to allude to a certain email chain, but you know, it looks like you have a lot of fun over there.
Well, business as usual for a writer. You know, we're probably, you know, among the careers that are least affected by lockdown, I would say. And I mean, a lot of people have it a lot harder, I think, in the UK and elsewhere. But I mean, the normal daily life of a writer is pretty unexciting. Lots of hours working from home. So I'm working on a new novel, which is that's pretty much what I'd say any time of the year, any point in my life. I'm always working on a new novel. That's keeping me suitably occupied. As Alex has alluded to, I'm also building a P-51 Mustang in my conservatory. Not a real one, but it is 1/8 scale, and it will fly one day. So that's a nice little nice thing to sort of think about.
Yeah. Well, I've got to ask you the question of the moment, Alastair, and it's without getting too heavy. I mean, is this the science fiction future that you had imagined?
What year now in 2020?
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
Not really. It's like it swings and roundabouts, isn't it? There's lots of good stuff in the world that we would miss if we didn't have it. Certain types of connectivity, that kind of thing. But I'm a child of the late Apollo era. You know, and I grew up with that. You know, that background of the expectation that we would build on the Apollo program by going back to the moon, going on to Mars, building, you know, big space stations, and really establishing a serious human presence in space. And I genuinely thought that was all going to happen in my lifetime. And it could still happen, but I thought we'd be well on the way by now. And I remember when I was sort of narrowing down my career options when I was sort of in my teens, and I really want to do astronomy, but I'd love to be an astronaut as well. And when it's sort of, you know, I got the idea that was probably a little bit unrealistic, but I thought, hey, I can go in through the back door, if you like. If I study astronomy, by the time I graduate and become a professional astronomer in the distant future of sort of 1998 or something like that, there'll be radio telescopes on the moon and that kind of thing, and we'll need astronomers to go out there and service all this. So I can still get to go to space through the sort of medium of doing astronomy. Because I thought it would be like kind of like the sort of British Antarctic Survey. You know, there'll be sort of a constant need for scientists to man these experiments and projects in space. But that didn't happen. But there's still lots of exciting stuff going on.
So if I just pick up on that, I mean, you know, you and I are very similar in age and we similar backgrounds in the UK. In fact, I remember you went to Newcastle, right, as your undergraduate, and then to St Andrews for PhD.
That's right, yeah.
And I actually interviewed in Newcastle, but then chose to go to Edinburgh and stayed in Edinburgh for both degrees. But I think you're absolutely right. You know, they're growing up at a time when, you know, people were setting foot on the moon, and then there was, of course, it was beyond that. Of course, it was Skylab, and it was also Apollo Soyuz. I mean, even in, you know, the Cold War was in some weird way didn't exist in space in quite the same as it existed on the ground, and there was that idea of working together and that we can do these things, and that in many ways led to the space station that we have today, where earthly politics is not visible, but it's a lot less present. And so I just, but the flip side of that, of course, is, you know, why didn't we do those things? And of course, Apollo was a child of the Cold War, and it was a child of politics. So as I grew up, I sort of began to realize, well, yeah, in some ways, it's kind of better that we're not in that Cold War, which then leads to doing those projects. But of course, the disappointment is you don't do those projects to prove your principle. So I wonder, how do you see that now, in retrospect, in a political sense?
You should mention Skylab, because that was one of the first sort of actual space endeavors that I connected with as a kid. I grew up at the tail end of Apollo, but I don't have any direct memories of the actual moon landings. I do remember that the fact of people going to the moon was a thing. So there were sort of dinky toys of sort of lunar rovers and things like that you could buy, but I didn't really connect with it as a real thing that was happening until Skylab. And then I was tremendously excited by the Apollo Soyuz link-up. And as you say, it was a real harbinger of international cooperation in space, looking beyond the Cold War. And I thought that was fantastic. And also, I was really amazingly excited by the first shuttle mission to Mir. I mean, that was something that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. You know, real progress. I try and take a sort of global view that we may not have had the progress in human space exploration that it looked like we were going to have, but at the same time, we have explored, and you know, a large part of our solar system. We've sent spacecraft to all the major planets, put a fair number of things into orbit around a fair number of things, and we've landed lots of things on lots of things. And all of that is, I mean, you wouldn't want not to have had that. I mean, the sort of developing picture of Mars we have now is really amazing, and it would be a tremendous shame if we had to have sacrificed that, say, for some progress in sort of human spaceflight. It would be nice to have both things, but we can't always have all one.
I was just sort of going back again. I didn't realize this, but you know, my school books had pictures from Skylab cut out of the magazines and stuck on the front, and I was just suddenly remembering that, of course, one of the astronauts on Skylab was Owen K. Garriott. And he was a NASA astronaut, but then his son flew in space as a tourist, right? Richard Garriott.
Right.
He was in the gaming world, Lord British. I think maybe he was born in the UK, but his father was American. I can't remember how that worked out now.
Okay.
So that is the other route. You just have to write a few more books and get a lot richer, and you'll be able to go as a tourist soon, right?
Yeah. I always thought I'll consider the space tourism thing when they knock a few zeros off the cost.
Would you go on suborbital flight, or would you kind of say,
I'll do it tomorrow? Yeah, sign me up now. I'll do it now, right now. Right. Yeah. No, I have constant fantastic dreams about space flight. You know, I would take any opportunity to go to space.
Well, last week we had on Uplink, we had Loretta Hidalgo Whitesides, who's the co-founder of the founder of Yuri's Night, but of course the name Whitesides. Her husband is the CEO of Virgin Galactic. So if you're listening, Loretta, this is a candidate. Get this guy up. He can write brilliantly, eloquently about what it'd be like to go on a suborbital flight.
Yes, well, thanks, Mark. Yeah, that'll work.
That's what we're doing it for.
Yeah.
So how are you doing, Alex? Is Pippa?
Yeah, we're going to see if we can get Pippa to join. She's just having a couple of glitches, but we're working on it. So it's okay. All good, certainly. But I mean,
go ahead, Alex. Go on.
Go ahead. I mean, well, I guess one of the things that always I think is assumed by people, and I mean, this is in no way a statement on anyone's age here, but by people who've been born, after the moon landings, after certain watershed moments in space exploration. The assumption is, always just that, these things were possible. But of course, because I don't have that, memory of a world where, that had yet to happen, and so I probably don't really register the same kind of, impact, that people at the time did. And, remembering, that time before. And, by the same token, I mean, science fiction is just such a ubiquitous concept, these days as well. And so it almost seems like the two things are completely intermingled. And I just wondered what you thought, Alastair, about what science fiction has done to perhaps drive space exploration, and perhaps how space exploration is actually, kind of driven, science fiction as well.
I think one of the things that science fiction has done, it sort of had two roles. One in the sort of early days of before we'd even left the Earth's atmosphere, it sowed the idea that it might be possible space exploration was feasible, and that there might be a way to put people on the moon. The problem with science fiction, as it's sort of publicly understood since then, is I think it almost downplays the technical challenges of space exploration. So people say, why can't we have warp drive now, that kind of thing. Science fiction's done a service in some respects, but it's also sort of undersold the really amazing difficulty that still lies in space exploration. I'm not. I mean, I'm very into space flight as a human being. It's one of my interests, is following sort of development in space exploration, space science. As a science fiction writer, I'm in much more of an agnostic sort of position. I don't see myself as an evangelist for it, either one way or the other. I'm far more interested in taking a particular stance for the purposes of a particular story or a set of stories, and then just following that sort of perspective to its conclusion. The subtext of that might be that it's not actually a good idea to go into space, because when we get out there, there'll be sort of killer robots from dead alien civilizations that will try and wipe us out. I don't hold to that view as a civilian, if you like, rather than a writer, but it's part of my package as a writer that I try and steer away from that sort of wide-eyed technological evangelism about spaceflight, because it's just not interesting to me as a writer to sort of just constantly be flag waving for spaceflight.
Yeah. We were just discussing this very briefly before you joined, Alastair. Just the fact that many times I think science fiction, it loses sight of the core of what is the most important thing, which is just telling a good story, right? Not merely wowing people with these imagined worlds, but also I guess creating characters that people care about, right?
Yeah, if you have to have a story and character are absolutely paramount. And my sort of rule of thumb is if you cannot, if the science prohibits you from telling a good story, then the story should triumph over the science. Not in sort of ridiculous terms, but ultimately the sort of the givens of narrative and the sort of essentials of good writing should always be what guide us when we're creating fiction. Not how many nuts and bolts does it take to build a moon rocket or something like that.
Indeed, no question. Well, well, here's something that never happens in science fiction movies: is links not working or other things.
That's right. Yeah.
What absolute pleasure it is to have you joining us today, and not a moment too soon. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm fine, thanks. I'm really sorry I'm late. It took me some time to navigate the wonders of Zoom for some reason, even though it's worked before. So it's just really nice to be here. Hi, Alastair. Hi, Alex.
Hello, Pippa. Hi. Good to see you.
It's a real pleasure. Well, I mean that's the excitement of show business. So it's all good. Well, we were actually just.
Where are you at the moment, Pippa? Oh, talking over Alex. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm in Frankfurt. Okay. We just moved here about 5 minutes before the virus hit, so it's kind of an odd environment to be in.
Is that a long-term move, or is that related? Yeah. I mean, you've done some things where you've done writers years abroad and so on, but this is longer term. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, because we've lived in Germany for about a year altogether. Over the past few years, we decided to spend some more time here, and my partner got a job here in Frankfurt, and I'm supposed to be writing a book that's about my family background in Frankfurt. But of course, I'm not able to actually get out and sort of do any research, so it's a bit theoretical.
Well, I mean, this is one of the really interesting things. So, I mean, I think a lot of people come into the world of writing via other means, the world of science fiction. But I guess what you and Alastair have in common is you're both incredibly qualified to write on the subject of science, or indeed science fiction as well. I mean, what was a bit of your background, Pippa, before you got into writing full time?
So actually a bit like Alastair, I was also an astronomer. I did a PhD in astronomy at the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh in observational cosmology. So I studied very distant objects called quasars and tried to figure out how they formed in the early universe. And I did that for 4 years in Edinburgh. And then I worked at Imperial College in the Astrophysics group for about 5 years, again on galaxy formation, quasar formation in the early universe, and using lots of data from telescopes and satellites, and trying to fit sort of models to that. So I did that for a fair number of years, and then I got a bit fed up with academia, and I joined the UK government as science policy advisor, and I worked in outer space policy, and I had what sounds like a really great job title. I was a regulator of outer space. It wasn't sort of quite like that. Sort of the British equivalent of NASA is more like a sort of broom cupboard somewhere in Victoria. But I did that for a few years and I really, really liked it. And then I just gradually got into writing, and I realized that it was interesting to explore writing about science and even about science policy from using fiction as a sort of tool to investigate scientific processes. So it was kind of a gradual move away from the actual process of doing science to writing about it.
Yeah, because just before you joined, we were discussing just what science fiction can do to sometimes drive space exploration, and vice versa. And I guess it's just always just been assumed that the two things, were completely intermingled, but perhaps that's not always been the case.
I think they are intermingled in a way. I think a lot of scientists have taken inspiration from fiction. I mean, I think that's actually what I'm quite interested in, is how intermingled the worlds of reality and fiction actually are. We tend to think of fiction as something that's quite separate from fact, and something that should be quite divorced from fact. But in fact, fiction is a very good tool to investigate the world and also to help us predict the world, which I'm sort of guessing is what you might have been talking about, is how science fiction is such a powerful tool to explore what we could do and what we should do in the real worlds, and how it's a powerful tool because it involves our real emotions and sort of our morality and our sense of what we feel about the universe and the world around us. And that should also be used to guide us, I think.
Do you agree with that, Alastair?
I do, yeah, very much so. I was thinking in relation to what Pippa was saying, particularly about her sort of trajectory from science to fiction, sort of mirrors my own sort of path. And I sort of came to a kind of realization a few years ago, was that I just don't have the right mental toolkit to be a really good scientist, because I really love science and I'm fascinated by science, but I'm drawn to science in all its ramifications. And academic research does, to some degree, require that you narrow down your focus on a very small area of science. So for me, that was sort of interacting binary stars and I'd gone into astronomy kind of with the hope that I might end up working on cosmology, sort of big questions about the ultimate fate and origin of the universe. But I ended up working in stellar astronomy, which is really interesting. But nonetheless, there was I always felt there was that itch there to just sort of swim in a wider environment of scientific interest. And the realization I came to is that actually there are really only two career options for people with that mindset. One is someone at science popularization, where you can sort of really sort of rove around science as you wish, just sort of attracted by anything that passes your fancy. The other is science fiction writer, or writer writing about science and fiction and the processes. So I've kind of had that. I've come full circle now, and I'm completely comfortable with where I am in my own skin as a writer who used to be a scientist. But it did take a certain bruising encounter with real science before I came to this realization that actually that's not really what I'm cut out to do.
So I'm curious now, and don't take this the wrong way. Did you bump into some cosmologists and actually realize that most of them are sociopaths and you should stay well away from them?
Oh, I'm a sociopath. That's fine. No, I
stellar astronomers and star formation, but we're lovely, right? But cosmologists.
I just wasn't brainy enough, Mark.
Oh, come on.
No, you have to be really good at maths, I think, to do cosmology. That was always,
well, you have to be good at self-publicity in certain way. I mean, there's all sorts of things that go into it, right? So
you're digging a deep hole, you know.
People view science as a rather linear kind of white coat, straight thing where you have to sit down, do your calculations. And it's not. I mean, it's a very social dynamic as well, and it's a very it can be cutthroat, it can be collegial, it can be all the things that ordinary life can be. And in part, just, you know, the reason to riff off that is it's partly what we're trying to get to with space rocks and with things like Uplink, is to sort of remind people there's all sorts of ways of appreciating the universe. It might be as a scientist, it might be as a writer, it might be as a just a film watcher, right? And none of them the right way. And in fact, they're actually much more entwined than people typically think, right? And you two are a prime example of that. You've gone from one area to the other, where now you're not constrained by the laws of physics, although, you know, probably it hurts when you break them, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting, Mark, because I think a lot of people's ideas about the scientific process are actually that it's a much purer process than it is in practice, as you know, because you're a practitioner. It's actually a very complex, messy, rich process that involves people's personalities and emotions. And when you go to a scientific conference, for example, and I've seen this when I went to cosmology conferences, you see sort of like, you know, dust-ups in the car park. You see people having punch-ups over their different sort of their favorite model of dark matter. And yet that doesn't actually come across in quite a lot of the time in the academic sort of interactions on paper, on the sort of in the academic articles, and also in popular science too. I think popular science sometimes feels a bit too constrained, that they have to present the great successes, the great sort of stories of discovery, which are fantastic, and I love reading about that. It's wonderful. To read about, say, sort of images of black holes and how that was achieved. But even so, I think there's still something missing in that type of narrative, and that is just how people's scientists' emotions are so engaged in their subject matter, and how that influences the way that they sort of interact. And I think that's one of the things that I wanted to explore. But I think perhaps Alastair's being a bit sort of harsh on himself when he says that he wasn't cut out to be a scientist, because I think the best science fiction writers, and Alastair is, you know, one of the best science fiction writers, you need that sense of a sort of rigor, because you have to create a world and then sort of describe that world to the reader. And I think that takes just as much sort of rigor and analysis as pure science does. And it takes something else. It takes imagination and the ability to describe that world too and convey it to the reader.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pippa. That's very kind. To go back to what you were saying about the sort of human culture of science, I think it's a very good point. And it's something that's not widely understood or represented outside of scientific communities. And you know, recurring dreams. We many of us have the one about not revising for an exam or something like that.
Still,
I realized a long time after I left ESA that I was having a recurring dream about a paper that I couldn't get past a referee. And I thought, this is such a specific thing to scientists that you talk to any scientist, they probably sort of nod sagely, oh God, yes, I know exactly what you mean. The process of peer review and refereeing is an enormously important part of scientific culture, but not one that's really understood outside of it. But it can be really cutthroat.
Yeah.
You know, it's done anonymously, but you often sort of think, oh, I know who that guy is. I know who's that. You know, he's got an axe to grind to get with me, hasn't he? Because of that dust up in the car park.
Yeah.
You know.
That's right.
Two thoughts there. I mean, one interesting one is that since you guys have left active field, and I'm, you know, just on the end of it now in the role I have, we are now using more blind reviewing, double blind, so that reviewers don't know who the authors of proposals are, and vice versa. So, you know, of course, that way has always been the case, but now you don't know who's written the proposal. So it's incumbent on you to write it in such a way that it kind of takes yourself out of it. But that's changed a lot of the genesis and the results coming out, and the young versus old, and, you know, because you shouldn't desocialize what we do. That's important, but neither should you be biased by it and saying, well, of course, that person had a great theory 30 years ago, they must be right today. No, they might be wrong this time. Yeah. The other thought that came to me there, and we've steered a little bit away from this in some of the previous ones, but I'm interested in how you see it now as active scientists who look at the kind of almost dystopia we're on the edge of living in here. We've had a lot of people talking about the fact that governments are being led by the science on coronavirus. And that's kind of, and governments have said that, and governments are holding that up as a mantra. You know, we're not playing politics here, we're being led by the science. And reflecting back on what we just said, you know, what is science? Science is not just a set of facts or rules, it's an interpretation and a modeling and a direction. So I'm sort of curious to see how you're seeing this, if you're daring to watch the television. You know, how, because you're living in Germany, and I think it's quite different there to the way it's portrayed in the UK at the moment. And everybody will say, well, it's just the science, it's the same thing. Well, is it?
I think that's really interesting. And having worked as a policy advisor in the UK and Scottish governments on sort of the science and also social policy, you can't just have the science, because when you're making decisions and judgments about people's lives and societies, it's not just the science that matters. It's basically whether people are capable of responding to what you want them to do, whether they're actually going to, say, be able to physically sort of socially isolate for, say, up to 3 months at a time. And as a scientist, you might think that's by far the best result, sort of way of handling the sort of medical crisis, but then you have to think about the wider social ramifications of that, economic, of course, but also, say, psychological, and so on and so forth. So as when you make policy, it is about the science, but it's about other factors too that you have to consider within society. But I did think it was interesting, actually, to sort of slightly disagree with myself on that. Angela Merkel gave a talk yesterday on German television. So my German isn't very good, so I can't actually keep up to date very well. So I'm still plugged more into the British media. But she gave a talk about the science. And of course, she is a scientist. You know, she has a PhD in chemistry. And she gave a talk about the actual effects, the social effects of trying to keep down the infection rate to less than, say, 1, down to what actual effect it would have upon German society and the medical resources. And it was an absolute model of clarity, the way that she explained it to people. And she explained the relationship between the medical advice that she was receiving and the social policy that was being made. And it's something that I have to say is lacking in the British sort of political discourse, and something that, obviously as a scientist, I would like to see more of, that kind of interaction between the science and the policy. It seems perhaps, I don't know whether you think that's the case, whether we do see the medical experts are very visible in this type of discussion that they haven't perhaps been in the past, but that's still not that element of sort of match up between the medical advice and the social policy that comes out of it.
Yeah.
I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not someone who has to make these difficult decisions about the sort of consequences of lockdown. And terrible pros and cons that have to be weighed, and I really get that. I think what was frustrating for me as a sort of bystander with an interest in science is that suddenly the government was making these proclamations that we're guided by the science, but they've always been quite willing to not be guided by the science in the past on other sort of policy issues. I think it's like a little bit cheeky to suddenly hold scientists up as you know, the universal saviors, and we will do exactly what the scientists say, because they've never done that in the past. Whenever it suits them not to, you know, to ignore the scientists, they've been quite happy to do so. But then there was this sort of rather dramatic shift in the UK policy from one of the proposal that they would seek herd immunity, which was kind of counter to the scientific policy that seemed to be adopted by most of the other European nations and elsewhere in the world. And that was abandoned rather quickly. And again, it was like, oh, it's the science has changed. And that, I mean, it's hard not to feel cynical about that. I think there'll have to be a really serious accounting of the decisions that were made and whose advice was really being followed at the time. People keep saying, you know, this is not the time to have that accounting, but I think actually it is. We should be having it right now. And asking serious questions as to why they seem to be handling things better in Germany, for instance, where they've done a lot more testing and contact tracing.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's so much there's such a richness of data that we really need to sort of start analysing. And like you said, straight away, we can't afford to sort of wait. Yeah.
So I saw something this morning. I'm sure you're both aware of Brian Schmidt, the Nobel Prize winner for one of the co-winners for dark energy a few years ago, and he tweeted something this morning. I think it was probably on Australian television or on Australian media about how hard it will be to develop a vaccine for coronavirus, because we never have. For any other coronavirus, there is no vaccine for one. And I was sort of taken by this idea also that it's because our lungs are actually, from a viral perspective, are actually on the outside of the body still. Because if you think about the way we get into the lungs, that the interface that we have there, if you put a vaccine, where the interface is in the lung is like trying to put a vaccine on the skin. And you know, it was fascinating to me and something I hadn't come across. And the reason I mentioned that is simply as a jumping off point into going back to the science fiction. Where do you get the ideas from for, you know, I want to take something and make something out of it? I mean, both of you I know have done this. Alastair, you've kind of taken a bit of latest science, something that's stimulated, and you've just blown it up completely and taken it somewhere. Is it just reading online? Where did the ideas come from?
Shall I jump in?
Yeah.
I've tried a sort of systematic approach of reading a lot of science and trying to spin off fictional ideas from that. That hasn't really been productive for me. I read New Scientist every week. I read Scientific American every month. I read popular science books, and I read websites like everybody else does. I don't tend to go to the really specialist literature anymore, but I find that I can be stimulated by what I do read. But it's never really worked for me in terms of reading, you know, going through, say, an issue of Scientific American and say, right, let's get a science fictional idea out of this issue. It just doesn't work. What does work is just a continuous process of reading and absorbing scientific ideas and letting it mulch down in the subconscious. And then maybe a year or two later, I might even be halfway through a story and some little synapse will fire. Oh, hang on, I mean, that could relate back to that thing I think I vaguely remember reading. At which point I will then go back and probably Google it and see if I'm misremembering or accurately remembering something. And from that sort of seed, a story with a scientific premise might flow. I mean, just to hop back to the thing I was saying about the sort of nightmares about refereeing a paper. In the end, I decided the only way to exercise that nightmare was to actually write a story about the refereeing process. So I wrote a piece of fiction about a scientist who was literally driven mad by a paper she couldn't get past a referee. But the idea that the engine of the story was a piece I'd read a year or two earlier about starling murmurations. It was about someone using mathematical models to characterize bird interactions in murmurations and to figure out how do they do it. Is where does the sort of sensory horizon lie for each bird? How many other birds is it sensing? And how does the sort of emergent behavior of the murmuration arise from presumably fairly simple rules? And I then went back and dug out that original article, but it wasn't a case of reading the article and then immediately setting to and writing a science fiction story. There had to be the sort of gestation period, and that's the only way it works for me. And that's why I've got a big folder on my computer with sort of half a dozen abandoned or semi-finished science fiction stories based around certain ideas. And they're all just sort of vegetating there, waiting for that synapse to fire, and then I get the other part of the story. But it has to be a constant ingestion of science.
Right. Before we come to Pippa, answer, just because you stimulated me, I don't know if you dropped off Twitter a few years ago, right? I mean, it was kind of taking up too much of everybody's time, but maybe at the moment. But I don't know if you're aware that Stephen Wolfram has just come out with exactly this, right? Theory of everything in a tweet. You know, it's 500 pages of stuff behind it. I'm in no position to criticize, but it was exactly that, right? He's claimed I've got an answer to everything. It's emergent behavior from simple rules, which in itself is a fascinating idea. But you know, whether this is the one or
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, Pippa.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying, that it's very difficult to do sort of systematic research. I always get the feeling that I should be doing much more reading than I actually am, that I should be reading New Scientist and Scientific American and, you know, watching all the dutifully watching all the educational documentaries. And I do a fair amount of it, but yeah, it doesn't seem to be very productive. And it's not that I don't enjoy it. I mean, I do it for its own sake, but it doesn't directly lead to ideas for new stories. And instead, I seem to just have the same old obsessions that I keep circling around. And that, I think, to be honest, it's just a part psychologically. It's because I was trained to be a scientist when I was relatively young, in my teens and 20s, when they're essentially my formative years. And I keep going back to what I learnt then, because I think I was in the process of developing, you know, becoming an adult. And so I keep going back to, for example, the practice of astronomy and what it feels like to go to a telescope and do observational astronomy, you know, with a big bit of kit on top of a mountain in the middle of nowhere, and what it feels to try and understand something about something, the universe that we can't actually grasp in our hands. I seem to be a bit stuck on the physical and psychological distance around astronomy. So I have my same few obsessions, but on the other hand, I'm in a position. I have a unofficial post at the University of Edinburgh, where I'm quite often asked to write short stories about all sorts of different topics. And I'm currently involved in a project on sheep farming in remote parts of Scotland, mainly upland hill sheep farming. And I'm writing a whole series of short stories about that. And that is a really good case of doing some research around a topic that I knew nothing about whatsoever, and then turning that into fiction. And I'm absolutely loving it because it is so different from my obsessions. It's really taking me out into literally new territory on the top of hill farms. So, and that's kind of made me realize that, in fact, as a scientist, I'm incredibly limited, because I only ever studied physical science and I never did natural science. And I feel that even more at the moment, you know, at the time of this crisis, that I know absolutely nothing about life sciences or biology or genetics or epidemiology or anything. And that feels to me to be such a huge lack that, in a way, I really wish that I'd studied life sciences instead of astronomy when I was younger. So I'd have more to say. They're kind of inherently more sociable, human-shaped sciences. But yeah, I think also, like Alastair, I have to let my ideas mulch down subconsciously. It's very difficult to read something and write a story about it straight away. And each story that I write has to have several wrong stories before I eventually hit upon the right story. And that process actually feels a bit like doing science, doing the wrong experiment, or doing the experiment wrongly until you hit upon the short story that just feels right. It has the right form and the right expression. And that almost never happens the first time, just as it doesn't in science.
I always feel that, and I don't really know how to write short fiction. It's still a bit of a mystery to me. But every piece of short fiction that I've felt was successful that I've worked on was the intersection of two unlikely ideas, or two ideas that don't really seem to fit together. Yes. And quite often I'll get the first idea. It might be something from the pages of New Scientist, but that's only half the journey. And for the story to really catch fire and to make me excited enough to feel that it's worthwhile finishing it, I need that second orthogonal idea that comes in at 90 degrees and that you can't really predict. No. And you can't force it either. I find it that it can take a year before that idea hits, if it ever does. So again, it's I like to have a conveyor belt of completely failed stories, so slowly working its way to the present. I should just say one thing. That, I mean, the literature of the body of literature about people actually doing astronomy is very, very restricted. But Pippa's novel, The Falling Sky, is one of the very few novels, and I'm struggling to think of even two or three that actually depict accurately the emotional life of an astronomer, let alone the technical ups and downs. So it's a real service to the world to actually put the real life of an astronomer in print.
I was immediately taken when you mentioned this idea of two ideas, a book I read last year. And anybody out there, I mean, I just love the short stories written by Ted Chiang, who he wrote the story which is the basis of Arrival, which is probably my favorite science fiction film in years, even though is it really science fiction? Again, what is it actually about? It's about language and memory and being human and everything else. Yeah, it's exactly that. You'll get halfway through the story and another idea will come in and you think, now brilliant, you know. So yeah, I love that idea. So Alex, I see you're sitting there. You may have some questions coming in online at this point.
We have many questions, but first things first though, Mark, there's a comment from Katie Mack, which is
very good.
Be nice to cosmologists. She didn't actually put it that way, but you know,
yeah, or else, right? Or else. Come on.
It's nice to have so many people joining us from so many different places.
That's terrific.
And some really wonderful questions as well. You know, and I think this is a really interesting one that I think really speaks to the kind of futurism that's always intermingled with science fiction. Is you know, it's really a question from the group from Alan Dowson, who asked, do you think the future of, you know, I guess you know, our move to space, is it driven by science or is it driven by commercialization?
Ooh. So I used to work in outer space policy, and it was always very much a balance. It seemed to me, sort of government interest in outer space was, at least in Britain, and increasingly now Scotland, was very much driven by the commercial opportunities, as well as pure science. And it seemed to be like a tension between the two that we're going to have to manage. And I think that's rich territory actually for science fiction to explore, because it's all about sort of human emotions. But I think we have to be really careful how we manage space exploration in the future, because increasingly, and I'm thinking particularly of two countries, America and Luxembourg, have passed space laws very much enabling the commercialization of outer space from companies based within their sort of legal territories. So yeah, I'm guessing in the near future that commercialization will be very, very important.
Yeah. So I just, you know, obviously I work for a space agency, so I have to be a bit careful about what I say. But for me, at some level, there's a kind of a mainstream mix of civilian space agencies doing exploration, going back to the moon, going on to Mars. I mean, these are, well, to say they're traditional, they kind of make sense, and they're things that we've said we're going to do. And if we get the resources and we get the planning right, we can do. But of course, at the same time, on the outside lane, there are the commercial enterprises coming along. And some of that historically has been about, you know, exploiting resources, mining asteroids, getting resources from comets and so on. I mean, Alice's book, Pushing Ice, touches on that, this whole business of using comets as a resource. But now, for me, there's also this real strand of manifest destiny coming through as well, that humankind was made to go into space. It is the next logical step. And it's much the same as Americans moving across the continent in the 1800s. And, you know, it's our right. We are kind of chosen people, and we should go to this place and bring our values. And at the same time, it's kind of mixed. Obviously, it's mixed with a commercialism, but I also wonder, to some extent, whether a lot of the popularity is to do with escapism. It's to do with the fact that this planet is actually becoming, you know, potentially difficult to live with and deal with and understand. And if we just go somewhere else, if we transcend the 100-kilometer von Karman line, we'll be in a much better place, right? And everything will fix itself, which is, of course, absolutely untrue. Because you'll have exactly the same thing with human beings, their emotions, their politics, commercialism, and there won't be anything to breathe or anything to drink. So you haven't made things much better. But I think that escapism plays a big role in science fiction in general, but very much in the way modern space is being viewed.
And yourself, Alastair?
I'm very on the fence about the sort of role of sort of private enterprise, particularly in space exploration. Not a huge fan of some of the things that have been going on. I mean, I just reading recently about SpaceX taking this sort of unilateral decision to put lots of constellations of satellites up into orbit, which obviously they're going to be a benefit to some people, but at the same time, it's a real headache for astronomers. There are sort of all-sky surveys that are now going to be will take a lot longer to complete, because a certain percentage of the images will have satellite trails across them. it was just done with no consultation, no sort of global oversight. It's almost like someone slapping a Coca-Cola symbol on the face of the moon, and we all just accept it. There has to be a little bit, clear-headed thinking here about what we do in space. I mean, perhaps because I'm getting a little bit older and I see the possibility of Martian exploration and colonization sort of slipping ever further away over a horizon, and I'm sort of somewhat doubtful that it will happen in my lifetime. I'm actually starting to come around to the idea that we need a kind of moratorium on certain activities in the solar system. For instance, we might suspect that there's a story somewhere on Mars about the early history of life in our solar system. It's a kind of pristine laboratory that we haven't yet had a really good chance to contaminate. I mean, we may well have done so inadvertently in a number of areas, but we haven't done wholesale contamination yet. And I think wouldn't it maybe be like not a really stupid idea just to sort of sit it out for 100 years, just to sort of keep, we can do all sorts of remote sensing, we can land on Phobos, Deimos, that kind of thing, but maybe not stampede to put our grubby fingerprints all over possibly the only, biological archive in the solar system, the only place where we have a really good sense of what may have happened with the story of life. And I would extend that argument to places like Europa and Enceladus as well. So it's kind of like, and it's a conservative stance for a science fiction writer to be taking. I should be saying, let's go for it 100%. Let's start sending submarines into Europa. Let's build Mars bases and things like that. But I'm just slightly backing away from that now. I think we need to be a little bit more a bit more long-term thinking, I think.
Yeah, but I don't think it's in conflict with science fiction at all. I mean, one of the TV series I've been watching over the last year or so is The Expanse, and The Expanse is pretty blunt about how it sees the outcomes of human society going into the solar system, and it isn't all at all a science fiction element. Something comes from outer space, but a lot of the story is about how humans will be exploited as workers, and how fights between the Earth and Mars may develop as much as they do on the Earth. Why would that not happen in space? So I think it is a good vehicle for exploring those things, but we also should, the danger is that the people who want to push forward and say it's manifest destiny, they will always take the shiny side of the picture in science fiction and ignore the more dystopian visions. And I don't mean dystopia in a kind of a negative way, but things can go very wrong as well, as you say, right? And should we think about some of these things a lot more before we just rush off and do them just because we can?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, Mark. I mean, when you mentioned things like manifest destiny, or earlier in the conversation, words like colonization. I mean, historically speaking, these things don't generally associate with good outcomes for many, many people. And I suppose that's always the danger in all of this, is that we bring our problems elsewhere. And I suppose, I've always wondered this about space exploration. I've asked this question in other contexts, Mark. If the true innovation that's represented by space exploration, for instance, in many of these utopian visions of the future, it isn't really about the technology. It's about the idea that we can cooperate as a species and see ourselves as one organism that can benefit through the sharing of resources, through the sharing of knowledge, and many concepts that are in many ways beyond our grasp even now, even though in this COVID situation, it's so obvious that a greater cooperation, might have led to a more immediate and perhaps more positive outcome even right now.
I think we already have the mechanisms for that cooperation with COVID, and also with outer space exploration. The United Nations has an Office of Outer Space Affairs and has done ever since the 1960s. We have the treaty that supposedly governs how we actually sort of behave in outer space, and how we should work together peacefully, and we shouldn't be sort of staking claims, for example, on territory in outer space. And yet and I think more should be made out of that. More should be made out of those those mechanisms, really. But they seem to be a bit toothless at the moment.
Yeah, it's a big question, certainly, and some great ones are coming in, from the group as well. There are so many great people, who are joining us today, and so I don't really know where to begin. Yeah, this is a really big one, certainly. You know, we're, gosh, wow. So what's, okay, I'm going through.
You're keeping
You
us
know,
in suspense here.
yeah. So what aspects of science fiction do you wish were real? You know, what concepts frequently? What are these tropes that arise that frequently, you know, I guess make you go like, gosh, I wish we actually had this or that. And that's from Janine 4.
I'll just take a stab at that. I mean, if you'd asked me that 10 years ago, I would have said, well, let's have seamless global communication. Let's have, you know, translation layers and all that stuff. Let's be even more connected than we are now. But even that, I'm slightly, you know, is this a good thing? Are we on a good trajectory at the moment? I mean, as Mark alluded to earlier, I've backed away from social media, not for any really highbrow reasons, but I just felt that it wasn't working for me. But we've seen, particularly with COVID-19, connectedness is not always a great thing, because connectedness also enables you to sort of promulgate conspiracy theories and organize into groups of nutters who go around burning cell phone towers, that kind of thing. There are unavoidable downsides to every innovation, and I think more and more as a science fiction writer, whenever I think, oh, wouldn't it be good to have that, then one needs to take a step beyond that and think of the downsides. Like, everyone wants a flying car or a jetpack, but that's only great if you're the only person in the world who has a jetpack or a flying car. I mean, that's what we all want, really. We want to be the first one to have it. We don't want everyone to have a flying car, because then it's boring again. So I don't know. I mean, in complete contradiction to what I was just saying a little while ago, I'd love to have the technological capability to get around the solar system really easily, so that we could go out to sort of the moons of Jupiter in a few weeks, like the sort of Discovery mission in 2001. And I'd love it if we had the means to send a spacecraft to another solar system within a reasonable human timescale. I mean, it's not forbidden by the laws of physics, but every sort of sensible scheme for looking at interstellar exploration using robots, we're still talking about multiple decades before you get any sort of data returns. But that would excite me if we could sort of find a way to shave a little bit of time off that. And I think what would be one of the great sort of stimulators or drivers for that would be the first clear image of an exoplanet, when we actually have sort of like something that's more than a pixel, particularly if it's a sort of terrestrial world. There might be, you know, maybe hints of oceans or ice caps on it or something like that. That would be an enormous spur to getting up close and personal with sensors. So that would be something I'd really like to see happen.
But would you see that coming from the perspective of sort of awe and wonder and connectedness? Because of course, inevitably these things get then turned into, well, let's go there, and you know, I mean, I think that there's a whole spiritual dimension to seeing our connectedness, which is, I think, that's where I would come from on that one. Is that where you're thinking, or more in a practical sense?
I don't really know, actually. I mean, I'm just, I think that I would be very, very excited to see a detailed image of an exoplanet, and no matter what resolution we had, we would want more. So if we had, you know, the merest hints that there might be, say, chlorophyll signatures in the atmosphere, that kind of thing, then we would have a tremendous desire to increase our knowledge, and that would just be an exponential process, because everything that we learned would drive us a little bit further. I don't know if that's a sort of networking issue, or it's just, I think that's just basic intellectual curiosity that would be the main driver there.
Very good. Pippa?
I'm probably going to stick more practically to the sort of self-transport modes. I've just moved to a country where even 2-year-olds seem to be able to ride their bikes with perfect ease. I never learnt to cycle even, I can't drive. So I'm pathetically limited in terms of transport, and I'm desperately hanging on for driverless cars, to be honest. So that would be amazing for me. And I don't care if everyone else had them too. And of course, they'd have to be sort of fueled by hydrogen or whatever, and, you know, sort of have a low impact and so on, but that would be amazing.
That's kind of that's achievable, isn't it? I mean, that's something that we could, you know, apart from,
I'm waiting.
apart from we've just pressed the sort of global reset button in 2020, but if we hadn't done that, then you know, things like driverless cars, I mean, they've been kind of on the immediate horizon for a few years now.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's the interesting thing is why they haven't happened. You know, there's a lot of stories in that, I think, as opposed to the fact they are just around the corner, literally, metaphorically.
Yeah, if you go to Mountain View in California, you'll see them running around, right? And they have drivers in them, but they're not driving them, and they're linked to Google and other people there. So yeah, they're around the corner, but they tend to have very wide roads in Mountain View with big curbs. It's not quite the English countryside.
Yeah, indeed. Well, you know, I gotta just sort of interject here for a second. I'm surprised that food replicators hasn't come up because, you know, just you know, but I guess it speaks to a point is, you know, people seldom realize that they're kind of living in a sci-fi reality right now because all this technology we're surrounded with is utterly mundane, and I think, like was said earlier, it's really boring because it's just kind of everywhere, which is so interesting. Which I think is a really nice segue into I think a great question from Matt is, in comparison to what science fiction predicts for humanity, for you know our what we're going to do in space and so on, is where space exploration is now a little disappointing by comparison, because of course science fiction always imagines these these vast futures for us all. Does the reality pair up in a satisfying way from your perspective?
Oh yeah, I'm amazed. I mean, I think back, I was an astronomer quite a long time ago, to be honest. I stopped doing astronomy 20 years ago or so, and the wealth of data and information from telescopes and satellites and sort of the solar system explorers is just phenomenal compared to what we had to work with 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I don't find it disappointing at all. I mean, the fact that we can actually image a black hole, the sort of the disk around the black hole, we can actually resolve that with our instrumentation on Earth. It just sort of blows my mind every time I look at it. The fact that it's easy to image distant galaxies in whatever wavelength you care to name is just so exciting. I remember working with, actually, I think it was ESA data, so 20, 25 years ago, and trying to look at galaxies in the infrared. And honestly, the images looked like porridge. They looked like, sort of fuzzy sheep on the hill at nighttime. And compared to what is available now, it's just, it's just out of this world, literally. So I just find that so endlessly exciting.
And yourself, Alastair?
Yeah, the richness of scientific discoveries that we have today, and the never-ending process of scientific discovery is in no way disappointing. It's absolutely remarkable. As I alluded to earlier, I'm slightly, I'm of that generation that expected that we would build on Apollo, we would quickly achieve a fully reusable, orbital capability, and that would lead on to things like space stations and moon bases and Mars exploration. For one reason or another, that didn't happen. Probably best not to dwell on it. And I wouldn't want to forego all the other stuff, like the amazing bounty of knowledge we now have about the solar system, which has been delivered to us by robotic missions. One thing I benefited from since I left professional science, if you like, 15 years ago, and I gradually drifted back into my roots as an amateur astronomer, which was the thing that had always sort of fired my enthusiasm for astronomy in the first place. And even there, I found that they were just amazing tools that were now accessible to the amateur astronomer that we probably would have killed for to do real astronomy. Just a simple example, you can take an image of the night sky with a telescope in your back garden and get an image using something that's much more sophisticated than a webcam. And you can take that, you can take a JPEG or something like that, and you can upload it to a facility. They will then do very, very high level pattern recognition to tell you what you're looking at. And you don't even have to say where you are or what magnification you're doing or which way up is down, which way up is north or anything like that. It just does it. And that would have been just incredibly useful when we were doing astronomy at, say, the Anglo-Australian Telescope in the 80s, because often you're committing hours and hours of telescope time to looking at a fuzzy sheep on a hillside. And you're desperately crossing everything you can that it's actually the thing you want to be looking at. But you're not really going to be able to look at that data in sufficient detail until you get back to Scotland. And it'd be a horrible blow if you discovered you were actually looking at one star over from the one that you were terribly interested in. But that happens. That really used to happen in astronomy because it was so difficult to actually make sure you're pointed at the right thing. But software like plate solving, which is this reverse pattern recognition, is just incredibly useful. And the fact that it's available to the amateur community as well is astonishing. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's just an enormous amount of software and gadgetry that is very, very if affordable or free, that's how I would put it to the amateur community. And that's something really fantastic, I think.
I think that raises a really interesting point about the rise of citizen science, not just in astronomy, but in biology too. That kind of merging, in a way, of the interests of the professional and amateur, so that people, it's like thousands of people can work together on problems. And I think that's fantastic. Real upside to be able to do that, to be able to have remote observatories, remote telescopes that school kids can use and actually contribute to astronomy with.
I went to an amateur astronomical facility in the south of France last year near Dax, and it was run by an amateur, but he had got a lot of support from sort of local community groups, and the facilities that he put together would have been easily the rival of a professional astronomical facility. And he was doing indeed like first class real astronomy, because there's so many things in the night sky that professional astronomers can't possibly point their telescopes at all of them. So there's always been a real role for the amateur to play, sort of monitoring variable stars and sort of looking for comets and asteroids and things like that. And it's great that is also the case in other areas, every sort of scientific discipline.
I just wanted to come back to this. I just want to come back to this meta topic question about is where we are disappointing with respect to what science fiction can imagine. And one of the things that's sort of occupied me for a long time is that by the time we grew up, the science fiction of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne had effectively been achieved. Not all of it, but submarines going deep under the sea, going to the moon, not out of a cannon, but a slow cannon, a rocket. And I wonder sometimes whether there's an assumption that because we made that first step, then anything we can imagine today will happen in the next step. And we were talking about this before you joined us, Pippa. So, Alastair was saying, will warp drives work? Can you actually teleport from one place to another? And I think sometimes science fiction has set the bar for itself so high and saying we achieved the last generation or the last century of science fiction. It's only a matter of time before we achieve the next bunch. And that's not necessarily a given at all, because if it's beyond the laws of physics as we understand them, of course, you can always posit, oh, new laws of physics will change everything. Don't worry, we'll have warp drives. So do you find yourself challenged by that in a way that people turn your work around? I mean, you've been to more star systems than I've even taken pictures of, Al, in your books, right? I mean, you've been there, you've done all that stuff, and yet it may never happen. So how do you face that disappointment in a way that you can take us there, but we may never even go there?
Yeah, again, it's just, I think as you get older as well, you just adjust to things. I mean, I'm not in no way disappointed as a human being. I mean, there's a tiny part of me that's disappointed in our lack of certain kinds of progress in space exploration. But that's just a tiny part of my personality. I mean, there's many, many things that we have in 2020 that I'm enormously grateful for. I can just reserve a little bit of disappointment for the fact that, I mean, we had the technological capability to go to Mars in 1981, let alone 2020. We probably could have done it nearly 40 years ago. But I'm over that. I mean, it's just, it's fine. We weren't on that track. Perhaps all that stuff will still play out, but on a slightly longer time scale. Perhaps it'll play out throughout the 21st century. In terms of, I mean, I never seriously expected that we would go to other solar systems in my lifetime, because I always thought that was just impossible. And even within the framework of the type of science fiction I write, I don't have fast and light travel as a rule. Do occasionally have it. And I try and restrict the plots of my stories to situations where the characters only ever travel below the speed of light. But even that is like enormously technically difficult. I mean, it's beyond comprehension how difficult it would be to build a spacecraft to travel at sort of 50% of the speed of light, let alone 99% of the speed of light. I mean, even that is almost as impossible as traveling faster than light. So I accept that, That's why my stories are set sort of 500 years in the future. So I can sort of hand wave all the sort of technical stuff and say, well, you know, by 2300, they've come up with these propulsion systems that enable them to accelerate a 1,000,000-ton starship to nearly the speed of light. But I'm fully aware that that is enormously unlikely, and may, you know, there may be a whole sort of slew of engineering and physical constraints that mean we never have such a capability.
You know, and we actually have a great question from Jeff, which in some sense you've already addressed. You know, partially that Jeff is. Do you feel like science fiction accurately represents or misrepresents the scale of the solar system, of the galaxy, of the universe, and so on? And this kind of speaks to something that we talked about earlier, which is just that after Apollo, for many, Mars felt inevitable. You know, but I guess the problem is that Mars isn't just a little further away; it's a lot further away. What are your thoughts there?
Do you want to take this one, Pippa?
Yeah, I'll take it. Yeah, I think that's right. Perhaps science fiction is guilty of sort of betraying this type of travel just a bit too easily. And I think, Alex, it's exactly what you said. It's too easy to forget just how far away even the nearest planets are, and you know just how long it will take to. You know, it took 3 days to get to the moon. It will take however many months to get to Mars, six months. And that is just like orders of magnitude more difficult. And there are huge technological problems to overcome to get to Mars. So I think perhaps, yeah, we may be a bit guilty of doing a little bit too much sort of hand waving sometimes in a lot of science fiction. And because we want, you know, we're too sort of in love with the idea of getting to these other places because we want to explore. We're creatures who love exploring. That's what we've done on our own planet. We want to get to these other planets. But yeah, just the solar system itself is phenomenally enormous. It took Voyager sort of decades to reach the edge of it, which is a fantastic technological achievement. The fact that anything made by humans has actually sort of gone to the edge of the solar system, and look how long that took. So, and I think also, yeah, crossing the galaxy, you know, you can say that really easily as a sort of short phrase, but you know, it's sort of hundreds, thousands, millions of light years across. These things are totally beyond our technological achievements at the moment, and will be just for the foreseeable future. So I think it's not only science fiction that kind of underplays that. In a bizarre way, I think astronomers actually do too. I was always struck when I did research on quasars, you know, objects that you see in the early universe, how little attention we paid to their actual distances. You get used to referring to their distances to in terms of redshift, which is just like a small number. You don't actually pay attention to how far away these things actually are from us. So it's easy to, this is what I explore in my fiction, it's easy to plot the universe on a piece of paper, to look at the night sky and see all these things, like sort of literally within our sort of like hand span. And it's too easy for all of us, scientists and fiction writers, to forget just the sort of the enormous expanses.
Yeah, I saw somebody earlier this week, and I won't misrepresent who it was because I might get it wrong, but there's a very lovely book by Becky Chambers. Is it the Long Way to a Small Angry Planet? I think is the name of the book. And I love the book. I mean, I really did. I enjoyed it thoroughly. It's a very human story, well, very humans meet aliens and how they deal with each other sort of space story. But somebody quite rightly raised an objection this week, saying there's a moment in the book where they kind of arrive somewhere and they look up and they say, and there in front of us was the star and the various planets. And, you know, we saw, you would never see a solar system laid out in front of you like that. It just doesn't work that way. And yet we're so used to it from science fiction movies and everything else. I've got a planet here and a planet there, and there's a star over there. And no, that's just not how it is at all. And the person, I think quite rightly, was objecting, you know, it kind of can break the concentration if you're trying to set things up that way. But we're all guilty of it. You're right. Even in professional astronomy, professional science, I call it big numberology. We just kind of wow people by saying it's billions. It's like, yeah, but what does that even mean? I can't get a hold of that. How do I make that human?
Because I sort of dug back into amateur astronomy over the last few years. One of the things I enjoy trying to do is image things in the night sky, be it planets, nebulae, some of the nearer galaxies. And that, for me, that's been a real point where I've reconnected with the scale of things, because it's amazing to take a picture of, say, something in Orion, some star forming region, and to calculate how many light years away it is. You think, okay, so the photons from that thing started on their way to us 800 years ago, maybe. Okay, so that was 1200 AD. Blimey, and then you go and say, what was happening in 1200 AD? And it was like, well, some monk was landing in Northumberland or something like that. And you get a visceral reminder. You're slapped across the face by the scale of things, and we're not even talking about very far into the galaxy. And I even with the solar system, I mean, Mark, round about the time of Rosetta, I was trying to take some images of Jupiter, and we knew that there was this little ESA spacecraft way out even further than Jupiter. And even Jupiter was this tiny wobbling blob in the eyepiece of my telescope. It couldn't have looked further away, and yet science fiction films, when the Enterprise leaves space dock, it's sort of like the Earth goes past, the Moon goes past, and then Jupiter. They're on their way out the solar system. It's like Jupiter is just next door, really, isn't it? But no, it's this incredibly distant thing, and just the sort of technological challenges in putting little bits of hardware beyond, into the outer solar system are absolutely daunting. And the timescales are things we don't map onto them very well, because they're kind of the timescales that people build cathedrals on, not.
Yeah, well, we just typically deal in timescales of a 2-hour-long film, or maybe a 10-hour-long TV series. It's all got to play out. Or reading a book, which might take me, well, depending on how quickly I read, a few days or weeks. We're just not used to spending 10,000 years doing something, and we can't, because we're human. We think in terms of sort of seconds and days, or at the moment we're learning to think in weeks of lockdown. But we're not really very good at even thinking in years, because a year, well, you know what I mean, right? We're sort of 1 meter tall or 2, we're at that scale. We're 100 kilos. We're not, our monkey brains are not wired to dealing with those things. So we tend to familiarize them. We write them down at a scale which we can deal with them as a story. We bring the humans in, and they deal with it in the normal way. But occasionally I'll come across a page in a book more than on a film, I think, where something will be described in a way where I'm just utterly in awe, and I suddenly get a sense of vertigo about what's just been made. In film, it's harder because it's on a screen and there'll always be somebody in the foreground. But I've certainly experienced that in some of your books, Alastair, that moment of like, bloody hell, that's big. Just what the hell is that, right?
It's interesting. I wish I could recall the name of the author who, I think it was for The Atlantic, actually wrote about the Apollo missions in a very different way. Where if you sit there and listen to the transmissions, it's more like a really, really long car ride than an adventure. And I thought that was such a remarkable way of describing it all. And Alastair, you said something that really chimes with a really great question that actually comes from Katie Mack, which is about whether you think another sci-fi device will ever be possible, which is very akin to how cathedrals were built, generation ships, right? This idea of, basically multiple generations surviving in one object and just slowly, glacially moving out into the expanse. What do we think about generation ships?
Well, first of all, hi, Katie Mack. Good to have you with us. Yeah. I love the idea of the generation starship. It's a perennial trope of science fiction. It's something that every generation of science fiction writers seems to be drawn back to it, because there are so many ramifications to the story. The sort of central, the concept is you put a bunch of people inside a big spaceship, and they don't get to see the end of the voyage, but maybe their great-great-grandchildren do. And there are all sorts of sort of social and ethical questions about whether is that a terrible thing to do from the outset, to condemn generations of people to only seeing the inside of this spaceship. And then there are sort of secondary issues, like what if they, do they all forget what it's about halfway across? Do they forget that they're on the spaceship? Do they forget what the point of the mission is? Or when they get to the other end, do they think, actually, we'd far rather stay on the spaceship than do any exploration or colonization? All of these things are really the little germs that you can spring a story off. I think to make us a generation starship work, you would just need a sort of tremendous amount of social engineering. We're nowhere near the point where we have the expertise to say whether that's possible or not. The only thing I mean, a few years ago, in one of my books, I started playing around with the idea that if in hundreds and hundreds of years we had lots of fairly isolated settlements on the edge of the solar system, out beyond the Kuiper Belt, the kinds of people who might exist in those settlements might be the kinds that would adapt fairly readily to the generation starship. So I had the idea that they might just gradually migrate away, and the distances between the ships would increase, but it wouldn't be a great a jolt to them. It would be a sort of gradual transition to the sort of nomadic life of sailing between the stars. But I mean, there's a very recent novel by Kim Stanley Robinson called Aurora, which I think was a Hugo finalist, and it's a kind of authoritative takedown of the notion of the generation starship. He doesn't really believe that it could ever succeed. So the novel is a kind of critique of the whole concept. So, but well worth reading. But for me, it's an idea that I know I'll be drawn back to. I mean, regardless of whether it's a sensible idea or not. I think it's
I mean, it's an as you say, it's an incredibly rich socio-dynamic. Yeah. And forget what it's actually doing, right? I mean, it's of course I've read a bunch of books like that, but the way you crystallize that, right? I've made a choice to go on one of these, but then my children haven't, and their children have not. And because, as you say, it may be great-great-grandchildren, but it might be 1,000 generations really to get there, right? At what point does that break apart totally and really beg questions about what you're putting in motion at the beginning, whether you have the right to do that? But of course, it's true on the Earth as well. We all do lots of things. You know, my children didn't ask to be born. I didn't ask to be born. We make those decisions for each other anyway, right? And
It's right, and I think it's why it's such a sort of rich story, because it's an analogy essentially of the way that we all live. We're all shaped by previous generations' choices. We've all been imprisoned by that. It's our lives are essentially an adjustment, trying to work out how we live with that, and to what extent we break free of that. I'm really drawn to the idea of communication around that, how you set up a system of communication that is robust enough to sort of last for however many generations, given that we can't do it on Earth for more than a couple of generations. So yeah, it's fantastically rich subject matter.
Yeah, and
I recall I was just trying to remember, I read a book recently about this where several generation ships were sent out at once in somewhat slightly different directions. You know, the robustness issues, if this one fails, this one will work. And at some point, one of the ships sees another one blow up. Obviously, something's happened on board. You know, they've fallen out with each other, but there's no communication. And then communication gets cut off after a couple of generations with this one. And they can observe each other still, but they actually fall apart, not only inside, but outside as well. And I think it was exploring this very broad idea that is it human to do that even? I mean, is taking us so far out of our social and cultural milieu. And I mean, our robots can go and do it. We can send our von Neumann machines out there and they won't care. I mean, they'll come back and then eat us later on. But yeah, are we made for it? And I think it's challenging to ask those questions on those timescales.
You know, it's interesting you say that, you know, because of course, I mean, anyone familiar with the timescales of space missions, just knows that, these things take decades, right? You know, from concept to execution and so on. And so in a way, maybe that is just important of, the mentality that's required to think generationally just about what we would need to do in order to achieve that. And we've actually had some really interesting comments on our little chat that's going. New Ninja says it's the social issues that are probably harder than the technological ones. And Matt Taylor, who's been watching, says maybe not washing for the last 3 weeks is just a bit of training, for that sort of future. So yeah, I wouldn't.
I haven't seen Matt for those 3 weeks, so it could well be.
Fair enough. Well, we're just coming up to the end now. It has been so stimulating. A final question, which comes from Charlotte, who has been watching from the very beginning. When did you fall in love with science fiction? Was it a book? Was it a film? What made you feel that tug at your heartstrings? Pippa?
I'll have to think about that, actually. Alastair, you're probably better placed, maybe.
Okay, well, I give a slightly different and contradictory answer each time I'm asked this. But I think it was a very young age seeing George Powell's version of The Time Machine. So it's a film from 1960, which I remember it was shown on television, not in 1960, but I would have been maybe 4 or 5 when I saw it. And just the notion of a man going into the future, that was mind-blowing enough. But the fact that he then wanders around the ruins of human society in the year 800 and 2000, yeah, that did it for me, I think. But somewhere in there is also Fantastic Voyage, where they inject the submarine into the patient. Complete crackers, sort of scientifically, but it certainly stimulated my imagination. But that's against the backdrop of Star Trek, was also on the original run of Star Trek, Doctor Who, and things like that. So, but certainly somewhere in there, that was the sort of inkling for me, the first sort of switching on of my science fictional brain.
So I think for me, actually, to be honest, it's probably more meaningful to read science communication, sort of popular science accounts of physics and astronomy when I was a teenager. That kind of really sort of switched something on, and I realized that there were other worlds that I didn't know about. I'd never even heard the term quantum physics until I was about 14, 15. And then I read a popular science account of the sort of the birth of quantum physics, and that totally blew my mind, along with Patrick Moore's books, to be honest, which I still find incredibly sort of interesting and well written. And I guess if you're going down a more sort of fictional route, it was probably 2001, I have to say. Just seeing that film and the layers of mystery, sort of as opposed to science communication, which always seeks to explain. 2001 doesn't seek to explain anything. It leaves you with this kind of deep and abiding sense of, you know, what on earth just happened there. That is just sort of extraordinary. I think I first saw that film when I was about 12. And it's just, it really stuck with me because I didn't understand it and I wanted to understand it, and I was really motivated.
Did you see it in the cinema?
I did see it in the cinema. It
yeah, me too.
It was re-released in
yeah.
the early 80s, and it was just, awesome.
Awesome. When I saw it, I wasn't mentally prepared for it, but it certainly left a mark on me. But I remember it's a long film. Yeah. There's lots of sort of quiet bits. There's lots of breathing. There's lots of where there's no dialogue, and it's this incredibly enigmatic ending, which people still argue about now. Yeah. And the credits started to roll, and it was a sort of Saturday afternoon in Bridgend at the local Odeon, and from a few seats back, a bloke goes, "Thank fuck for that," and that to me is indelibly associated with 2001 ever since. I mean, the ultimate takedown of the Star Child. But it became a film that was really significant to me.
Yeah, I know we've got to finish up, but to riff off that, I mean, one of the big, I would almost call it a disappointment recently that I had was, I mean, it's such a central film to my way of thinking about science, the universe, communication, filmmaking, music, so many aspects come together in that. And I got to the point where my kids were old enough that I sat them down in front of the TV to watch it, and they hated it. And it was because it was so slow paced, right? I mean, as you said, it's a very long film. I actually remember from when I was maybe 10 or so, for decades, I remember it having no dialogue at all, which isn't quite true, but there's so little in certain parts. So I'm just wondering where it could be that sense of awe, that sense of mystery, and because Marvel films have zero mystery in them. Let's be honest. Where is that for the current generation? What's going to inspire them in the same way? I mean, maybe making your books into film. I mean, there's such a scope there, but I don't know where it is.
I would imagine it will be, films like Arrival, Mark, which have that sense. They're not hectically paced. There is time for the ideas to be developed. Yeah. And I mean, the director of Arrival, the next film up for him, and I don't know when it will come out because of the virus, is his adaptation of Dune, which is one of the great sort of unfilmable science fiction books. Everyone who has a go at it fails. But I'm tremendously excited by that, and I think if Dune is done well, then it will certainly capture people's imagination in a significant way. I think it's. I mean, I don't mind the Marvel films, but as you say, there's no ideas in them. There's no. I mean, even the recent Star Trek films. I mean, you know,
Yeah,
they're
fun.
ideal.
They're fun, but I characterize them all with my kids as saying there's just too many pixels. You know, it's just too much. Just you know, make it slow down a bit, right?
Yeah.
But I think going back to what Pippa said, you know, that 2001 didn't try to explain itself. It just was just this enigma. It was like the monolith itself, you know, just inscrutable. Is why, you know, I still think it matters. I still think it will, you know, continue to mean something, because I mean, you know, Mark and I have spoken so often about, you know, the interconnections between, you know, art, music, science, and all that. And I think in so many ways, 2001 is the perfect fusion of all of those things, you know, just profound ideas and beauty as well, you know, which I think is, you know, rarely achieved in any sorts of films, but more frequently in books.
And we'll need to get you guys back to come and talk about music as well. We didn't even touch on that today. I mean, and Al, you have to stand up in your shirt at this point.
King Crimson t-shirt. Come on.
Exactly.
I mean,
there you go. So
yeah.
No, we'd love to have you back, and there's so much we could talk about, right? And the way that music works, the way culture and art play together, be fantastic. Thank you very much.
Absolutely right. Thank you.
On behalf of everyone at Space Rocks, and also all of you know, our guests, you know, who've been watching all along, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Okay, and thank you to everyone who watched. Okay,
last tradition.
We got to do
the tradition. Yeah, we have the Space Rocks goodbye. So space is the Vulcan salute, and rocks is
right
that. So we all have to do that.
Okay.
You can do it. Yeah, it takes a bit of training.
There we go. Excellent.
Thanks very much.
Very good. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.